By 2014, my friend Louis and I had been hiking buddies for years, and we went through the forests of Washington and Oregon together, baked ourselves to a crisp in the deserts of the Southwest, and scaled the peaks of the Sierra Nevada side by side. But next on our list was the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, or the Frank as everyone calls it. We planned to hike in, camp out, and see what the place had to throw at us. We loaded up the car, drove north from California to Idaho, and set out for what was supposed to be a straightforward long-haul trip. The drive took 2 days of heading up the I-5, then east into Idaho's interior, and then before long we saw the Frank's 2 million acres sprawled out ahead of us, a chunk of land so big that it dwarfed anything we'd tackled before. We parked at a trailhead near the middle fork of the Salmon River in a gravel lot with a faded sign warning about bears and fire bans, and then pulled our packs out from the trunk. They were really heavy, but seeing as they contained our food, our tent, our sleeping bags, our water filters, and much, much more, they were our entire lives at that moment. The first day, we stuck to the trail, moving steadily through the pine and trees, and the forest was very quiet. But it was kind of a gentle quiet, and we managed to make it around the 8 miles before we ended up camping near a creek at dusk, and day 2 was pretty much more of the same. We pushed deeper into the woods. The trail was winding through the valleys and up ridges as the underbrush started to get thicker, and it was swallowing up the path entirely in certain spots. We didn't talk much. We just walked, ate some trail mix, and checked out our maps every so often to make sure that we were headed in the right direction. At the end of the day, we pitched the tent on a flat patch of ground, boiled water for these instant noodles that we had, and then pretty much slept like the dead. 18 miles in, the Frank felt like ours. We felt dialed in, and we were ready for more. On the 3rd day, we started to feel a little restless, for want of a better word. Trails were fine for tourists, but we'd come for something real, so when Louis suggested that we ditch the path and cut cross-country and see what most people missed, I didn't argue. We veered off the trail, and the change was almost instant. The woods turned very dense, with trunks wider than my shoulders and roots that started to sprawl out like veins under the dirt. Moss was pretty much draped on everything, starting to dull the light of the sun coming in, and carpeting the forest floor so thick that it was almost like sponge under our feet. We moved a little slower, avoiding rabbit holes and scrambling over fallen logs, and while it made for much rough going, it truly was worth it. The place felt completely untouched, like we'd travelled back in time by almost 1,000 years. Then at one point, Louis suddenly stops and tilts his head to the side like he'd heard something. A second later, I caught it too. This low hum, steady and very out of place. It wasn't the wind or running water. It sounded artificial, almost mechanical. And me and Louis didn't say anything to each other. We just obeyed our sort of mutual curiosity and followed that noise. The sound grew louder as we pushed forward. Then after a few minutes, we broke through this thicket of saplings and saw it. A bunker sunk into a low rise. A steel door was crooked in the frame, and its concrete shell appeared to be covered in scratched symbols. Circles, zigzags, or lines that twisted into nothing really recognizable. And the hum came from inside, and once we were close enough, we could hear that it was some kind of heavy metal, all distorted and screaming vocals. It was then that I saw the door hung almost ajar, just an inch, but enough to allow the noise inside to spill out. Louis and I stopped dead in our tracks just a few feet short of the bunker's door. The music was aggressive and violent, either death metal or some kind of hardcore, but it wasn't the kind of music that had us approaching with such caution. It was the thought of the people playing it inside. Louis shot me this look. Sure, there was a chance that it was just a bunch of metalheads throwing a party in some old abandoned metal bunker, but what if it wasn't just that, you know? What if they were way out in the middle of nowhere for a reason? And I remember looking back at Louis and gently leaning my head back in the direction we'd come as if to say, "Let's get out of here." And he nodded. Then we turned to leave. We were aiming to put miles between us and that place before dark, and neither of us wanted to find either who was down there or what they were doing, but we'd only gone a few hundred yards before they found us. We were walking along discussing who in the hell would build a bunker way out in the middle of nowhere when two men stepped out from the tree line like they'd been waiting for us. They were wearing full camo, with faces hidden behind balaclavas, and each held a rifle that looked like something like an AK. Barrels were down, but gripped very tightly. My blood turned to ice as Lewis and I stopped cold. I could hear him breathing beside me, and I knew that he was sizing them up the same as I was. The two men didn't move. They just stood there for a second, eyes locked on us through those slits in their masks, with the hum from that bunker faintly audible through the trees behind us. And then suddenly one of them raised their rifle. "On your knees," he said. "Arms up." His voice was flat, cold, and there was no room for debate. I looked at Louis. His hands were moving toward his pack straps. Counting the people back in the bunker, we were obviously outnumbered, and considering our pistols were still in our packs, we were incredibly outgunned too. I started to ease my arms up, buying time when Louis moved. He unclipped his pack, let it drop, and then took off running. The thought of it hitting the ground snapped me out of that daze of fear that had come over me, and then yanked my own straps free, ditching that weight, and bolted after him. As we ran, a shot cracked out overhead loud enough to make my ears ring. The bark exploded off a tree to my left, showering me with splinters. I ducked, legs pumping, weaving in and out of the tree trunks as I followed Louis, and then behind me I heard someone yelling, "Cease fire! We need them alive!" After hearing that, I thought that they'd ease up, but maybe only a few seconds later more shots started coming out, lower now, kicking up the dirt around my feet. They weren't aiming to kill. They wanted us slowed down, crippled, easier to drag back. My lungs were burning, but I kept going. Louis was ahead of me, dodging tree trunks, but I matched him step for step. The gunfire suddenly stopped at one point, but we kept on running. I didn't know how far we ran. It had to have been a mile or two, but eventually we stopped. My legs were shaking. My chest was heaving as Louis braced against a tree. We checked to see if there was anything behind us, but there was nothing. No gunshots, no shouts, just the wind rustling the canopy. We'd lost the men shooting at us, but we'd also lost our packs, meaning all of our food, gear and maps were now in their hands. It was a pretty bad situation, one of the worst you could ever wish for, but there was nothing else to do but keep moving, so that's what we did. Without our tents and sleeping bags, that first night was brutal. The temperature dropped fast, cold seeping through my clothes and into my bones, and my stomach growled loud in the quiet. But there was nothing to eat, and we just huddled against a fallen log, and jackets were pulled tight around us. I kept my eyes open, expecting those men to creep up on us in the dark with their rifles ready, but they didn't. Louis barely slept either. We just sat there waiting for dawn. Morning eventually came, and with it, it brought hunger. We found some berries growing on a low bush. They were sour and barely ripe, and I ate a handful. I grimaced as everything was staining my fingers, and Louis did the same. We knew enough to avoid the toxic stuff, years of hiking paying off, but it wasn't enough to silence the hunger pangs. We eventually used the sun as a guide when it peeked through the trees, and we started moving south and towards the car. My head ached, this dull thud behind my eyes, but we had to keep moving. And the forest just stretched on, swallowing every sound but just our footsteps, and my boots were rubbing blisters into my heels. And we walked all day, stopping only to scoop water from some stream with our hands. Night eventually came again, and we found a shallow dip under an overhang of rock. We couldn't light a fire, as that was probably too risky, but we had no food to cook anyway. I eventually slept in little bits, waking up to every rustle of leaves or shift of wind. And day 3, I have to say, was the worst. My legs felt like lead. We found more berries, a few edible roots that Louis recognized, but again they barely touched the hunger. My vision blurred at the edges, and exhaustion was starting to sink deep. I lost track of time and just followed Louis's back as he trudged along ahead. He didn't look much better than I did. His shoulders were slumped and his pace was slowing, and we didn't talk about the men or the bunker or the guns. We just didn't say anything at all. We just kept walking. When we hit the dirt road, I swear that I could have cried with relief. It was nothing but a thin, rutted track cutting through the trees, barely wide enough for a truck, but my God, it was a road. We stumbled along it until a ranger station came into view. It was a low wooden building with a pickup parked out front. We were filthy, scratched up, our eyes sunken into their sockets. The ranger inside, a guy with a grey beard and a faded NPS patch, took one look at us and said, "I'll get you boys some coffee." And as we sipped from our cups, we told him everything: the bunker, the weird graffiti that we saw on the side with the symbols, the men with the rifles, and the fact that they chased us. He called the police, who showed up an hour later and took our statements and then sent rangers to check that spot. And we were hopeful. But when those rangers came back, they said the bunker was completely empty. No people, no gear, just the concrete shell and those scratched up symbols. There was no sign of our packs either. And the police didn't seem surprised. One of them even said the Frank had a history of militia activity, armed groups that'd gather, train, and sometimes party out there away from prying eyes. He figured we'd probably cross paths with a nasty one, violent types who didn't like witnesses, and we were lucky to be alive. They told us not to go back, not through that area anyway, and that was it. No arrests, no leads, just a warning and a shrug. In driving home, Lewis stared out the passenger window, staying silent almost the whole way. I gripped the wheel. My knuckles were turning white, just replaying all of that in my head. The forest that had been ours once, a place of sanctuary and recreation, but on the drive back it felt like something else, something hostile and uninviting. Lewis and I didn't talk about hiking again for a while, not in the Frank, not anywhere, and I've often wondered who those men were, and if they ever returned, rifles in hand, watching for the next pair of idiots to step too close. A long time ago now, my buddy Andre and I went hiking on the Lost Coast Trail. We'd been at it since early morning, walking along the trails, laughing about stupid stuff from work and just kind of soaking in the peace. By noon, my legs were pretty much screaming, and I could tell Andre was feeling it too, so we stopped to check the map and catch our breath. We found a little clearing just off the path with a big flat rock that looked good enough to sit on. I dropped my pack, pulled out my water bottle and took a long swig while Andre unfolded the map. He was always better with directions, so I let him figure out where we were while I rested. Andre was kinda just muttering to himself, tracing a finger along the map when it happened. This huge shadow slid over us, like someone had flicked a switch and turned off the sun for a second. It wasn't a little patch of shade either. It was big enough to cover the whole clearing. I remember freezing mid-sip, water dribbling down my chin as I looked up, but the sky was still that perfect endless blue with not a cloud in sight. And Andre must have seen it too, because he stopped talking and snapped his head up just as it passed over and the light returned. What the hell was that? He sounded spooked, and I didn't answer right away. Instead, my eyes were darting around, scanning the treetops and the skies for anything that might explain the large shadow that passed over, but there was nothing. There were no planes up there, no birds, and this was way before drones too. I didn't know of anything that could have made a shadow that big, let alone something that could move so fast and so quiet it was almost gliding. And then the breeze hit. It came out of nowhere, stiff and cold, rustling the trees around us and kicking up dust from the trail. It didn't feel like normal wind. It felt like it was chasing whatever had passed over us, like it was part of it somehow. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, and Andre went pale. He lowered the map and spun around, looking in every direction. "You saw that, right?" I just nodded, because what else was there to say, really? We stood there for a minute, maybe two, waiting for something to happen, and my heart was thumping at a mile a minute, and I could hear Andre breathing hard next to me. The woods had gone quiet. There were no birds, no bugs, just silence. It was like everything was holding its breath, the same as we were. I kept expecting to see something break through the trees or drop out of the sky, but there was just nothing. The sun was back, bright as ever, like it had never left. "We should go," I said, and Andre didn't argue. He grabbed the map off the ground and stuffed it into his pack, and we started moving. Neither of us said it out loud, but I knew that we were both thinking the same thing: get out of there now. We didn't even bother sticking to the trail. We just headed straight back the way we came, cutting through bushes and trees and ducking under branches. I kept my eyes on the sky, half expecting that shadow to come back, and I could tell Andre was doing the same. Every light breeze or rustle of leaves made me jump, and I had this awful feeling whatever it was would come back. It took us maybe an hour to get back to the trailhead, though it felt like longer. I was burning up and my shirt was soaked with sweat by the time we saw the parking lot. Andre's truck was still there, right where we'd left it, and I don't think I've ever been so relieved to see a beat-up old Ford. We threw our packs in the back and climbed in, and for a while we just kind of sat there catching our breath, staring out the windshield at the trees. And after a while, Andre broke the silence, asking, "It was probably just a bird, like a hawk or something flying low. Shadows can look bigger than that than they are, right?" It didn't sound convincing, but I could tell that he was trying to talk himself into it. "Right," I said, nodding even though I didn't believe it, and the wind was just a coincidence. He agreed as he started the engine, and I could hear the relief in his voice, like saying out loud made it true. "We're just freaking ourselves out over nothing," he said, and I wanted to agree with him, I really did, but I couldn't. A bird made sense, a big turkey vulture or an eagle swooping down, catching the light just right, and the breeze could have been random too. It's not like the weather stays still in the woods, but deep down, I knew it didn't add up. That shadow had been too big and too solid. It wasn't some flimsy bird shape. It was thick, heavy, like something massive had passed over us. Then the way it moved, so smooth and quick, it didn't feel like anything I'd ever seen in the sky before. We drove back to town, mostly quiet, radio filling in the space between us and country songs, and every now and then Andre would just glance at me, and I could tell that he was still rattled, and so was I. When we got to my place, he didn't stick around like he usually did after a hike. There was no cracking open a beer or rehashing the day. He just said that he'd see me later and peeled out like he couldn't wait to put distance between him and what happened. And to be honest, that night I couldn't sleep. All I could think about was that shadow and the breeze, and the way the woods just went quiet. I told myself it was stupid, that we just spooked ourselves like a couple of kids, but I really couldn't shake it. And eventually weeks went by and we didn't talk about it again. Life went back to normal, or at least it tried to, with work and bills and the usual grind helping us keep our minds off the shadow. I even went hiking again, though not on that trail, and nothing weird happened. But every time I'm outside now, especially on a clear day, I catch myself looking up. I don't know what I'm expecting to see, but I can't help it. That shadow's still there in the back of my mind, and I still get the feeling that whatever caused it wasn't just some bird. I looked it up online once late at night when I couldn't stop thinking about it. I typed stuff like big shadow in sky and unexplained things in woods into Google before scrolling through pages of conspiracies and blurry photos. Some people talked about UFOs, others about giant birds or government experiments, but none of it seemed to fit. Not entirely, anyway. Whatever we saw, or whatever we didn't see, seemed stranger than that, like it was something that didn't belong. My mind wandered, exploring possibilities, but in the end I felt silly. I just shut my laptop, feeling dumber for even trying. Andre and I still hang out, but we really don't hike much anymore. It's not like we decided that, we just stopped planning trips, and I think we both know why. Neither of us wants to say it, but the day changed something. We can't really laugh it off, call it a fluke, but there's this sort of quiet thing between us now, a sort of shared secret that we don't touch. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, circling the woods, waiting for someone else to come across it. I'll never forget how small it made me feel, standing in that clearing watching the sky for something that never showed itself. I don't know if it's dangerous or if it's just there, but I know deep in my gut that it isn't normal. I was part of a search and rescue team dispatched to Olympic National Forest in the summer of 1983. The call came in late Tuesday night just as I was finishing a shift at the station. Terry Fishgold, a local hiker who had been walking the trails for years, hadn't returned from one of his solo trips. His wife had waited until Monday evening before she called it in, figuring he'd just stayed out longer than expected. When he still wasn't back by Tuesday, She gave us the details and a description of his gear. His last known location was a trailhead near the Quinault River, and his intended destination was a ridge around 8 miles north. It sounded routine. Terry knew the forest and we had a clear starting point, so I'd have bet my last dollar on us finding him by sundown. But as it happened, that particular search and rescue operation proved anything but routine. Including local law enforcement and a bunch of civilian volunteers, around 30 to 40 of us gathered at the trailhead just before dawn on that Wednesday. We loaded up with the usual radios, first aid kits, maps, rope, and flashlights, and then split the search area into a grid. My team and I took the western edge of the grid near the river, while the others fanned out east. The plan was to sweep north, hit the ridge by nightfall, find fish gold, and bring him home. Then, at exactly 5:47 a.m., we hit the trails. The first few hours dragged on with little to report. We moved slow, scanning for broken branches, scuffed dirt, or anything that might show Terry had passed through. We'd called out his name every so often, but apart from that, the forest was quiet. But then, around noon, the voice of one of my team members buzzed through my radio and broke the silence. He'd found something. I adjusted my course and then hiked a half-mile east to meet the rest of my team. When I got there, they were all looking up. High up in some tree about 30 feet off the ground was a backpack. It was torn open, its straps were flapping, and the contents had spilled out onto the branches and ground below. From its appearance alone, we knew it was fish gold's, and it was just as his wife had described it. A green keltie with a red patch stitched on the side. One of my team, a guy named Jim, volunteered to climb up, rigging a rope and harness while we watched from below. The tree was thin, its branches were too slender to hold much weight, yet the pack was lodged up there, caught like it had been thrown with an impressive amount of force. When Jim brought it down, we saw the damage up close. The fabric was shredded, with long gashes running through it. No bites or scratches from what we could tell. It was more like something sharp had ripped it apart. Inside, Terry's water bottle was cracked, and a soggy sandwich sat just half-eaten and crushed with the dirt. And there was no blood, though, not yet from what we could see. That came afterwards. 2 hours later, one of my team radioed in. She'd found one of Terry's boots in a small clearing. I hiked over, and there it was, just like the Danners his wife had mentioned him wearing. Brown leather, laces tied, standing upright like he'd stepped right out of it. No blood, no damage, just the boot sitting there alone. We marked the spot and moved on, figuring the other one would turn up close by. It didn't. About an hour later, one of the other teams called from the eastern edge of the search ring, almost 2 miles away. And when I heard what they had to say, my blood turned to ice. They'd found the second boot, but it wasn't empty. Terry's foot was still inside, cut off just above the ankle. The bone break wasn't clean, the skin was torn, and a few flies were circling it. And the blood was still sticky too, meaning it hadn't been there very long. The other team said that they snapped a few photos for the report and then they bagged it and moved on, but after that the force started to feel heavier to me. We'd seen bad injuries before, falls, shootings, animal attacks, but this didn't fit. A bear might tear into someone, but it wouldn't leave a foot in a boot, severed clean and dropped miles from the other one. We widened the search after that, breaking the grid into tighter sections, and not long after we'd noticed the blood. The first time I spotted some, it was on a tree. It was a small smear, no bigger than a coin, staining the bark at eye level. One of my team found another spot 10 feet away, higher up, like it had been flicked there. Then another pointed out more droplets splattered across the cedar's lower branches. We started marking them with flags, and it didn't take long to see the pattern, or rather, the lack of one. The blood was everywhere, tiny specks of it spread across the forest in every direction. I'd taken a few steps and found another dot, and then another, like someone had taken a blood-soaked rag over entire sections of the woods. But late afternoon we'd covered almost half the grid and found nothing. No body, no clothes, just the pack, the boots, and his blood. A few hours later the sun was starting to set and a fog was rolling in. We stuck closer as a group, not really talking much at all. We just kept moving, marking blood spots and searching for our missing hiker. Night came fast, and we set up a base camp near the ridge. The plan was to rest as much as possible and then pick up at dawn, but I couldn't sleep. The forest was too quiet. There really didn't seem to be any wind or animals, just this sort of eerie silence. Then at around midnight I heard a branch snapping. It was loud and sharp, maybe 100 yards out. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight and swept that beam across the trees, but I didn't see anything move. I stayed put and things stayed quiet till I was relieved, but it was the same unnatural quiet, the kind that you'd never hear in the woods at night unless something's making everything else stay quiet. I got a few hours of sleep after a teammate took over the watch, but morning didn't bring me any relief. We packed up and pushed north, following that blood trail, and it kept going, smeared on trunks and dotted on branches with some spots so high that I had to tilt my head all the way back to see them. I found one mark on a pine tree 10 feet up, with no limbs below it to climb. The blood looked fresh, like it had been put there while we slept, and I remember that sense of creeping apprehension growing as I marked it on the map. One of my team found a cluster of droplets on a rock arranged in a rough half-circle. Another spotted more on a fallen log, a thin line of blood streaking the moss. We stopped trying to make sense of it at that point. We just kept going, hoping to find Terry or, by then, what was left of him. And by noon on the second day, we'd reached the outer edge of the search area, but on account of the pieces we'd found, the prospects of finding Fishgold alive were getting slimmer by the minute. We tried our best, covered all of the ground we'd set out to, but it was no good. We called off the search on the afternoon of the third day. Terry was obviously dead. No one could lose that much blood and still be walking around. We radioed it in, packed it up, and left the rest to local law enforcement. When we hit the trailhead, I looked back. The trees were just standing still, the fog was starting to roll in again, and officially, Terry wasn't anywhere in the grid. But my gut told me that wasn't all the way true. The official report listed this as an animal attack. The bear made sense for the torn pack and the severed foot, but I knew that it wasn't right. No bear could toss a pack 30 feet into a tree onto branches too weak to hold its weight. No bear could spread blood across miles of forest, painting it on bark and rocks like some deliberate mark. I've seen bear kills, the torn flesh, the scattered bones, the mess of guts left behind. But this was different. The report got filed. Terry Fishgold was declared deceased, and his body stayed unrecovered. It was one of 3 failed missions that we had in the 1980s. Most of us moved on after that and took desk jobs or left the field entirely, but I couldn't let it go. The pack and the tree stuck with me, and every so often my mind would wander off and I'd see the pack hanging there, shredded and out of reach. I'd think about that foot and that boot too, all raggedly severed like it had been torn off and dropped for us to find. I'd remember all that blood and how the branch snapped, sharp and close, and how I'd been almost certain that something was out there watching us. The team didn't talk about it much after. One of my search and rescue team members, Paul, stayed in touch the longest, and years later I asked him what he thought actually happened. He simply told me we didn't find him because he wasn't there to find, and I knew what he meant. I just didn't agree that he wasn't there. Whatever took Terry wasn't to bear, but it tore him apart piece by piece and marked the forest with what was left. I think he was still there too, or I know he was, because of how fresh the blood was on that second day. Another team member, Lisa, quit search and rescue a year after. She moved inland away from the trees and didn't leave a number, and Sarah disappeared too. Not missing, just kinda gone, not forwarding an address. Our guide, Jim, stuck around much longer and he got kinda quiet and he started to drink more, and I heard that he took a job with the Forest Service. Irony of ironies, really, though we never really talked about that mission. I don't blame him. We all carried it differently, but we carried it all nonetheless. I kept the map from that search. The blood marks are still on it, little X's in red ink stretching across the grid like a web. I don't look at it often, and when I do, it's not unusual for a shiver or two to run down my spine. Terry was gone, but something else was there instead, waiting in the woods we'd never search again. I used to be a forestry surveyor back in the 90s, working up in Vuntut National Park in Yukon, Canada. On paper, the job was simple. Map the land, mark the trees, note the changes, but in practice, Out there, it was anything but. The park stretched over 4,000 square kilometers, a sprawl of dense forest, jagged ridges, and boggy lowlands that could swallow a man whole. I'd been at it for years, comfortable with the solitude and the long days of nothing but myself in the forest. In late August of 1993, I was deep in the interior, further than I'd ever gone before. My pack was heavy with gear. The nearest road was a 3-day hike, and the ranger station even further. I was completely and utterly alone. And that's how I liked it. The day started normal. I woke up at dawn, broke camp, and headed north through a thick stand of spruce. And I'd been following a drainage line, plotting its curve for the survey, when the trees ahead started to look a little off. They weren't standing right. They were tilted, leaning outward like they'd been pushed by some powerful force. I stopped, adjusted my pack, and squinted through the branches. Beyond them was a clearing, a rough circle punched into the forest. I stepped closer. My boots were sinking in slightly into the earth, and that's when I saw it. Everything within that circle, the trees, the shrubs, the dirt itself, it was all bleached and ashy white. Not burned, not frosted, just sort of drained of color. The trees kind of stood there like skeletons, their bark peeling in dry, powdery flakes, and as I walked, the brittle ground crunched under my weight. I'd seen plenty in those woods, fire scars, beetle kills, even the aftermath of a bear tearing through a campsite, but this was different. I moved forward, drawn toward the center, despite the growing sense of unease in my gut. There, in the middle of it all, was a crater. It was small, maybe 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, little more than a shallow scoop in that white earth, and I stood over it, staring down. There was no meteorite, no rocks, no sign of what had just made it, just an empty hole. I remember how still the air was, no birds, no winds, no nothing, and how I felt a sharp and sudden chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't place it, but something about that spot made my skin prickle, like I was being watched by very unkind eyes. I shifted my weight, and I decided that I needed proof. I dropped my pack and pulled out my analog camera. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with the lens cap, but I managed to line up some shots. I got some wide angles of the blasted trees and a few of the white expanse, and then close-ups of the crater itself. The shutter clicked with each photo. I took a dozen pictures, maybe more, becoming more and more unsettled as I did. This wasn't just another log entry. This was something my bosses needed to see, something the scientists were going to be very interested in. And once I was done, I packed the camera away and slung my bag over my shoulder and started that trek back, only too glad to be getting away from that place. I knew there had to be an explanation for it, but still, the place just gave me the willies, seeing the aftermath. The walk out of the woods was a long one, maybe 6 or 7 hours in total, and I'd planned to camp another night. But after seeing that strange white patch of forest, I wanted solid walls around me at that point. The first couple of hours were fine, just the usual ache in my shoulders from the weight of my pack, but then after a while the headaches started. I figured it was the strain, maybe dehydration, so I stopped and drank pretty deep from my canteen, but it didn't help. My stomach started twisting into knots, a kind of dull pang that got sharper with every step. And by the time I hit the last ridge before the ranger station, I was sweating like a pig. With the station in sight, I stopped and leaned against a tree to catch my breath, but then, just as it felt like my head was clearing, I threw up. I vomited. It hit me fast, a hot rush that left me gasping. I spit and wiped my mouth and realized that there might genuinely be something wrong with me. I stumbled through the door of the station just a few minutes later. The ranger on duty, a guy named Pete, looked up from his logbook and just froze. I must have been a sight. Pale, sweaty, and swaying back and forth, probably a little puke still on my shirt, and he grabbed the radio before I could even say anything, and then barked something about a medical pickup. I didn't hear the rest. My legs gave out and I hit the ground and I puked again. Pete rushed over as my vision started to blur and I felt hands on me and then nothing. I woke up in an ambulance. My head pounded, my skin was thick with sweat, and an oxygen mask covered my mouth and nose. The paramedics were there and their voices were very professional as they asked their questions like where I'd been, what I'd eaten, or if anything had bitten me. And I mumbled about the crater and the white trees, but the words came out just kind of jarbled. And I don't know if they gave me anything, but I remember blacking out again, and the next time I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. And the room was sterile. There were white walls and these beeping machines with an IV line tugging at my arm, and I just felt completely hollowed out. But I guess I was alive. When a nurse realized that I was awake and that I could hear her, she called a doctor into the room. He was a tired-looking man with these very thin glasses, and I was relieved when he told me that it was good news. He said their best guess was that I'd been hit with some kind of viral infection, something really nasty that most probably came from an insect bite. But after stabilizing me with IV fluids and antivirals, I'd probably be out in a few days. I nodded. My throat was dry, but my mind went straight to that crater. It wasn't a bite. I knew it wasn't. I told him about the impact site, the bleached circle and the empty hole, and he listened, scribbling some notes, and then left. And he'd said he'd keep it in mind, but I knew he wasn't listening. Delirious people probably say crazy stuff to him all the time. All the doctors can do is work with what's in front of them. And I got discharged a few days later, still shaky, but able to stand on my own, probably with a hefty bill. And back at headquarters, I handed over my camera. My boss, this gruff guy named Harris, took it off my hands after asking me to go over what I'd seen. And after that, I sat in the break room while the tech developed the film. I needed those pictures. They'd show that I wasn't crazy and that something real had actually happened out there. Now, just so you know, some National Park Service facilities used to have photo dark rooms to develop film photographs taken by rangers and photographers. And that tech eventually came back about 90 minutes later, and his face was just blank. He laid out the prints on the table, and my heart sank. Every shot of the impact site was a white, fuzzy blur. Not overexposed, not underexposed, just a static mess of nothingness. The other photos, the ones from earlier in the trip, were fine. But the crater and the trees and the bleached white bark and soil, they were all gone. I remember staring at the prints. My hands were clenching the table at the time, and the tech just shrugged, muttering something about a bad roll. Harris didn't say much. He just told me that I had it rough and I should take it easy. And no one accused me outright, but I felt it. These sort of side glances, the way conversations stopped whenever I walked into a room. They didn't think that I was lying, but they sure as hell thought that I'd imagined the whole thing while burning up with some fever. And I tried explaining how the timing didn't fit, how I'd been fine until I left that impact site, but no matter what I said, they'd still give me these insincere nods and looks of pity. And without proof, it was just me talking, and my words simply wasn't cutting it. In the end, Harris told me to just drop it, and that it was bothering the rest of the team, so I tried to. Routine dulled the edges, and just keeping busy with these mapping trails, counting trees and filing reports made it easy to pretend that I'd moved on. But I hadn't, and I really couldn't. Every other trip out, I'd scan those woods, sort of half expecting to see that ashy glow between tree trunks, and I wanted more than anything to find that strange white impact site again so I could mark it on my map. But at the same time, I didn't want to expose myself, or anyone else for that matter, to whatever made me sick. And that's what made it easier to keep my mouth shut, but I never forgot about it. I started warning the new guys to stay away from anything strange or unfamiliar, and they'd just kind of grin, thinking that I was spinning some tale or playing a trick on them, but I meant every word. The forest wasn't just trees and dirt. Sometimes it hides things that'll make you sick, things that just don't belong. Now time rolled on, and after my retirement in '04, I moved south to a little house near Whitehorse, and the nightmares eventually tapered off. But that memory really stuck around. I'm old now, pushing 70, and I wanted to share this with you all. My hands shake worse than they did back then, and my knees creak when I stand up, but my mind works just fine. And sometimes I get to thinking about what I saw up there back in the 90s. I kept those blurry photos, shoved in some envelope in my desk drawer, and every so often I might pull them out and just stare at those white smears and sort of wonder. And after doing some reading, the meteorite theory just doesn't quite fit. There was no debris, no heat scars, and if I had been exposed to radiation or some kind of chemical, then the doctors would have found it in my system during one of their tests, I assume. And I guess I can't rule it out entirely, but I'm not a believer in anything celestial or intergalactic, and most likely there's a total rational explanation for what I saw and what happened to me afterwards. I just can't for the life of me figure out what that is. I'd like to know, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, in my old age, I guess it doesn't matter, because whatever it is, if I ever see it again, I'm walking straight the other way. A few years back, I decided to go for a hike by myself. It wasn't something I did often, but I'd been feeling cooped up like I needed to get out and breathe some fresh air. I grabbed my keys, threw a water bottle into my backpack, and drove out to this trail that I'd heard about. It was an hour or so from my house, tucked away in some woods that I'd never explored before, and the drive was quiet, just me, the hum of my engine, and the trees blurring past the windows. I parked my car in a little gravel lot near the trailhead, locked it up, and started walking. But that's where things get a little fuzzy. The next clear memory that I have is me driving back home, hands on the wheel, and the sun dipping low like hours had just slipped by. But everything between? Gone. There was a black spot in my head, like someone snipped out a chunk of film and stitched the ends back together. I tried to piece everything back together that night, sitting on my couch with a beer that I barely touched. I could picture myself pulling into that lot, the gravel that was under my tires, the faded wooden sign marking the trail, and I could even see myself stepping into the woods and hiking steadily along the trail. There's this one fleeting image that keeps popping up, me walking through those woods, everything calm, but that's pretty much it. Everything else is just a blank wall in my mind before I'm back in my car, driving home like nothing happened. It creeped me out very badly, and I kept asking myself what the hell could have happened, but I couldn't think of anything. The next day I called in sick to work. My head was feeling pretty heavy, and I couldn't focus, and I kept staring at my hiking boots by the door. They seemed to be caked in mud, little pine needles sticking in the laces, and all the proof that I'd been out there, I guess, but I couldn't remember stepping in that mud or brushing against those trees. I started wondering if I'd hit my head or something, so I went to the doctor. He poked at me and asked some questions. He checked my eyes and my reflexes, all that kind of stuff, and he said I seemed fine, that there were no signs of a concussion or anything weird, and he told me to come back right away if it happened again, and got another one of those memory gaps. I said I would, but driving home from that appointment, I felt this in the pit of my stomach. He said I was fine, but I didn't feel right. That evening, I remember sitting on the couch in front of the TV, but I wasn't really watching. I was just thinking, sort of like waiting for something to click. I thought maybe I'd just zoned out on that hike, like when you drive somewhere familiar and don't remember the turns, but that wasn't that. This was hours upon hours that I couldn't remember, like they'd been stolen from me. So I got up and grabbed my phone and looked up that trail online. It was called Black Pine Loop, some old path not many people used anymore, and I scrolled through a couple of hiking forums hoping for something useful, but most posts were a whole bunch of nothing. People talked about deer sightings or how the trail needed upkeep, but then I found this one thread buried deep from a guy who'd hiked a few years before me. He said that he'd felt off the whole time, like something was wrong with the woods, and he said he found a stretch of trail where the trees looked wrong, very thin, twisted like they had some type of disease. He didn't mention anything about memory loss or anything like that, but reading about those trees got me thinking, and then by the time I got to overthinking, I shut my phone off and didn't look again. And days eventually turned into weeks, and I tried letting it go, and I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my friends or family, I mean, really, what was I going to say? Hey, I went for a walk and forgot the whole damn thing. They'd probably think I was nuts. I'd catch myself zoning out, staring at nothing. Sometimes I'd think it was happening again, and panic would start to hit, but thankfully it hasn't. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened with that time loss was tied to that trail. When I was a kid, my family loved the outdoors. My dad was in the Air Force, stationed at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, so we often went to Farmington Canyon, especially in the fall when the trees turned bright red and gold. The drive took about an hour, but the dirt road was scary. It hugged tight against rock walls on one side with a steep drop on the other. Sometimes cars had to creep past each other, inches from the cliff, and I'd look out my window and see tiny trees far below, and I remember kinda just shuddering. One trip stands out back in the 90s. I was thrilled because we were camping in a tent, a rare treat for me. My dad's bad back usually meant day trips or cabins, but this time we borrowed an old 70s tent from a garage sale. Me, my parents, my siblings, and our 2 dogs piled into the car. We reached the campsite by a creek in the late afternoon, and then set up the tent, laughing as the dogs just chased each other. We built a fire, ate some hot dogs, and then when it got dark, we doused the fire and crawled into our sleeping bags. I fell asleep to the sound of the creek. But sometime later, I woke up. One of our dogs was growling low, his fur bristling, and at first I thought it was just a rabbit because earlier we'd seen a few hopping around. Then I heard it. Crunch, crunch, the sound of footsteps on the forest outside. My whole body froze stiff as a board. Someone was out there, moving around our camp. I was so scared I could barely breathe. The footsteps got closer, and I heard them circle the tent slowly. The dogs' growling got louder, but I stayed still, too scared to move, and I could tell the person was poking around, maybe checking our stuff. I even tugged at the car door, but it was locked. Was it a camper from another site? Someone lost, or something worse? Someone who wanted to hurt us? I heard them crunching again, louder, right by the tent, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that they'd go away. The dog growled sharper, and suddenly the footsteps stopped. They then started again faster and moving away. I laid there. My heart was pounding until I couldn't hear them anymore. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, but eventually I heard my dad's whisper. He'd been awake the whole time, listening too, and he didn't say it, but I could tell he was scared. He waited a bit, shook my mum and siblings awake, and then announced that we were leaving. We packed up fast. No one talked much, just stuffed sleeping bags and tore down the tent by flashlight, and the dogs stayed close, but they were still on edge. It was around 1 a.m. we piled into that car. The canyon road was darker than ever, and as we drove, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see someone in the shadows. My dad mentioned seeing cars full of college kids heading up earlier, and he said maybe it was one of them, but he didn't sound too sure. We got home safe, but I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. Was it someone who was lost, looking for help? A thief checking campsites? Or someone who lived in the woods watching us from the dark? I'll never know. But even now, years later, when I hear the crunching of footsteps on the forest floor, my heart skips a beat. Maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Good Story podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends.